that, I'm going to introduce our first presenter. Jamie Gass is the director of the Pioneer Institute for Center for School Reform. At Pioneer, Jamie Gass has framed, commissioned, and managed over 60 research papers and numerous policy events on K-12 education reform topics. Jamie has more than 2 decades in experience in public administration and education at the state level, municipal, and school district levels. Give a warm Buckeye welcome to Jamie Gass.
Thank you, Seth, so much, and I want to thank Heidi and Tia for assembling this event tonight, but also I was here about a year or so ago, and they assembled 3 excellent events in 3 cities that attracted about 1,000 people, and that was really impressive. I have to say, we've been working in about 20-some-odd states across the country in the last several years on Common Core, and the level of grassroots activism in Ohio has been really impressive. I also want to thank Aaron Tuttle, who has been one of the real architects of the recent effort by Indiana to pull out of the Common Core, and that's just something that's gone on the last couple weeks. So Aaron is over here, and I want to acknowledge him. So my name is Jamie Gass. I'm director of the Center for School Reform at Pioneer Institute, which is an independent, nonpartisan think tank in Boston. We've been around for about 20-some-odd years. We are accept no government funding whatsoever, and are known pretty much for laying out high-quality, peer-reviewed, data-driven research on public policy issues, education being the central focus of our work. We like to think we are one of the big drivers behind Massachusetts becoming the number one state in the union in terms of K-12 education performance and internationally competitive in math and science. But I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. So let me give you some historical context to help you get a sense of how we got to this point where 45 states had adopted Common Core. I think the founding fathers were very wise. They understood that the national government can do some things well. Most of them have to do with defense and trade and foreign policy. But that most of the issues that most intimately connect the lives of citizens are really best left to the state and local level. And I think K-12 education is a marvelous example of that. While the U.S. Constitution is virtually silent on K-12 education, most of the state constitutions are incredibly detailed. I'll use the example of my home state of Massachusetts, where John Adams in 1780 drafted what is now the oldest written constitution in the world, and there are a variety of other constitutions that have these kinds of clauses, where he talked about it's the interest of future legislators and citizens to cherish the interest of literature and science and mathematics. And in fact, it's one of the primary functions of life in our republic. The founders, I think, understood that in order to perpetuate a democracy like ours, you need to have a well-educated citizenry, and that public schooling is the wellspring for that citizenry. But they also were extraordinarily wise about understanding that state governments, as good as they are, that it's really the localities. And the fact is, if you looked at the history of public education, you look at the history of the country, it's really localities, parents and teachers and students at the local level that have really driven K-12 education. And I would argue that it's really this arrangement, they call it federalism, or competitive federalism, where the national government does certain things and the state and local governments do certain things, that really took this country from a loose collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard, and within a little over 200 years made us the most powerful country in the world. We know that by law and by tradition that these public institutions can work, but they can't be smothered by lots of layers of regulation and bureaucratic red tape. And these are observations that, going back centuries, when foreigners come and visit this country, like Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a Frenchman who came to this country in the 1830s to study what this new democracy was all about, he said that, what is going on in the United States is just profoundly different from what is going on in France or Europe or other countries where kings and queens and ministers and monarchs all determine these questions of public policy from the top level, but that in this democracy, this new democracy that he was witnessing in the 1830s, these decisions come from the local level. And so that gives you a little bit of a sense of sort of where we've been, but I think there's no question that by like the late 1950s or so, and really came to prominence with Sputnik, which really launched the space race, that K-12 education in this country was beginning to fall behind. A lot of the international measures were making it clear that we had dropped from among the top tier and the higher performing countries in the world, really by the early 1980s to about 20th or 25th in the world. Ronald Reagan's administration initiated a report called A Nation at Risk, and what it characterized was the decline in public education in this country was so profound that that report said that if it had been inflicted on us by a foreign enemy, that it would be an act of war. Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Education, Bill Bennett, so indelicately described the special interest groups, both in state capitals, but also primarily in Washington, D.C., that had begun to kind of wrap themselves around K-12 education. He described it as the D.C.-based education blob. So we've had, and you have all heard these kinds of stories about the poor performance. There's a lot of people that have come up with top-down solutions. In fact, many of the folks that are driving the Common Core for decades, the Council of Chief State School Officers, which is the commissioners of education in each state, the National Governors Association, Achieve, Inc., the Fordham Institute, which has had deep roots here in Ohio as well, the American Federation for Teachers. These folks for 25 or 30 years have really believed that the way to solve the problems in K-12 education is to emulate Europe or other countries and have a set of national standards and national tests and national curriculum that's all dictated on high. Pioneer Institute, where I work, and a variety of other think tanks like the Buckeye Institute here in Ohio have preferred other routes. We're big fans of school choice, and we think the way to empower parents and is to actually give them choices, whether that's through charter schools or vouchers or education tax credits or other modes. But my home state, Massachusetts, really pursued a different path. In 1993, Republican Governor Bill Weld got together with two Democratic legislators who had very deep relationships with organized labor, and they crafted what is known as the Massachusetts Education Reform Act of 1993. The Ed Reform Act of 1993 really encompassed two things: an enormous infusion of both state and commitment from local communities to a minimum level of funding. The funding was very progressive, particularly for the low-performing urban districts. But in exchange for the money, which is in some respects the easy thing oftentimes to do in public education, they traded off all the hard things that people in public education had not wanted to do over the previous several decades, and from my point of view had led to the decline that the country had experienced and that Massachusetts had experienced too. I should be clear about that. As well as Massachusetts is doing now, the fact is that by the early 1990s, our SATs were about the national average. So what they did is they coupled this great deal infusion of money in exchange for high-quality academic standards in English, math, science, and history. We weren't going to do fuzzy math. We weren't going to do self-esteem math. We weren't going to have kids write essays about how they felt about math. We weren't going to do informational texts. We weren't going to do, lots of, writing about how kids felt about things. We were going to have them read the classics of poetry, literature, and drama that have the higher quality vocabulary that is necessary for success throughout the rest of children's education, but also for success in careers. I would argue that the importance of the vocabulary also, in reading these texts like Huckleberry Finn or Sherlock Holmes or Charles Dickens, is that they're the kinds of texts and books that teach us about the stories that make our children human. When you're reading about Huck, Finn, and Jim, a runaway slave, you're learning about children are learning about friendship. They're learning about compassion and love and comedy and tragedy, and these are the things that bind us together as human beings, and really is sort of the first principle of what education is really all about. And then in the area of mathematics, Massachusetts made sure that we had access to high-quality Algebra 1 by 8th grade. They had Massachusetts policymakers learned lessons from the high-performing East Asian countries like Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea and Japan, all the kinds of countries that the Nation at Risk report in the early 1980s said you have to compete with those countries to compete with the highest performing countries in the world. You've got to compete with them. And so Massachusetts made this deep commitment to basically a liberal arts curriculum. That this was a big shift. A lot of people around K-12 education, both nationally and in Massachusetts, had been pushing for workforce development as the major focus of K-12 education, but that's not what we did. We included high-stakes testing for students so that the graduation diploma meant something, and then we made sure that the teachers were also tested on the same academic material that the students were. And I'm not sort of explaining this to you or talking about it by way of bragging about my state. I'm trying to give you an example that we actually don't need to look to Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea or Japan anymore, that we have models of high-quality standards, and we've got models here in the United States of high performance. And let me just tell you a little bit about that. So there's a test called the NAEP test. It's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's called the Nation's Report Card. Every state takes it. It's been around for 35 years or so. No state has ever been number one in every category tested in English and in math, as well as every grade tested. And in 2005, Massachusetts was the first state in the union to do that, to run the table, every grade tested, every category tested, we were number one. And then Massachusetts did it again in 2009, 2007, 2009, 2011, and just a couple months ago did it again in 2013. And the reason why this matters, and the reason why I mention this, is because it's the high-quality standards that Massachusetts developed that was the central component of why we did so well. But as I mentioned, the Nation at Risk report said you've got to compete with the high-performing East Asian countries in order to compete in the 21st century. And so Massachusetts and Minnesota did too. In 2007, tested as its own individual country on a test called the TIMSS test. It's the gold standard international math and science test. And Massachusetts students in the 8th grade were tied for number one in the world in science, and we were in the top 5 in mathematics. And we replicated that again in 2013. So again, these are hard-won lessons from a state that spent 20 years working on these kinds of efforts, which kind of gets us to where we are with Common Core. So in 2007 and 2008, the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, two Washington, D.C.-based trade organizations that don't represent states, they represent governors and commissioners of education in each state. They sat down with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and decided that the way to fix the problems of stagnation and decline in K-12 education was going to be by having a set of national standards, testing, and curriculum. A lot of these players were the same players that pushed for this in the early 1990s under the Clinton administration, and an effort fell flat on its face. And again, I think it's important to remember that while this race to the top that I'll talk a little bit about here was pushed by the Obama administration, there have been a lot of Republicans, including Jeb Bush, including the Fordham Institute in Ohio, that have also been pushing for this. And so it's not a partisan issue by any sense of imagination. And so what happened is that in 2009, the Obama administration had passed through Congress the stimulus package. And part of the stimulus package, there were no specific hearings about the race to the top. There was no discussion of national standards or national tests or national curriculum or any of this. But baked into the stimulus package was a thing called Race to the Top, which was a $4.3 billion contest that was being driven by the Obama U.S. Department of Education, in which states had to agree to compete for that money, but they had to sign on to a variety of different policy objectives that the Obama administration said that they needed to sign on to participate. And so that is how most of the states adopted Common Core. They adopted it through a federal grant program, which I'll talk, there's some problems, legal problems about that, which I'll talk about in a bit. And so that's, again, 38 to 43 of the states adopted through this federal grant program. and then including Massachusetts, by the way. And so what we decided to do, what Pioneer decided to do, we're independent researchers, and because they had to have Massachusetts, we're the highest performing state in the union, internationally competitive, they had to have that trophy on their mantelpiece so that they could get other states to fall in line. What we decided to do was take a look at what's the quality of these standards. Massachusetts had the most to lose. So we got a woman named Sandra Stotsky who worked on the standards in Massachusetts in English language arts and in mathematics and other subjects. We coupled her with a guy named Jim Milgram who worked on the very high quality mathematics standards in California. Another guy named Zev Werman, who was a Silicon Valley engineer who had worked on the really high quality math standards in California. And we asked them to sit down and objectively crosswalk and evaluate the quality of Common Core against high standard states like Massachusetts and Indiana and Minnesota and Texas and California. And in these exhaustive 40 or 50 page evaluations, what they found is at the end of the day that the Common Core was of significantly lower quality than what the high performing, high standard states in the Union had. Specifically, they had ignored in English language arts the evidence from Massachusetts that the way to improve student reading is through high-quality classic literature, poetry, and drama. The research that we did on it illustrated that Common Core in high-standard states like Massachusetts and Indiana was going to be cutting classic literature, poetry, and drama by about 60%. So they completely ignored all of that evidence. On the mathematics side, it's not any better for Common Core. What Jim Milgram and Zev Werman found was that Common Core ignored the evidence from Massachusetts, it ignored the evidence from Minnesota, it ignored the evidence from Indiana and other states and the East Asian countries, and pushed off access to Algebra 1 to late 9th grade or early 10th grade. In addition to that, Common Core employs a form of experimental geometry that's never been successful in any place that's ever been tried, including the former Soviet Union. And then it really tops out at Algebra 2 Light. So if your child is interested in the STEM fields, of science, technology, engineering, or mathematics, Common Core math is really a path to nowhere, because there is no pre-calculus, there's no calculus, there's no trigonometry. So it was becoming increasingly clear that in both English and in math, the Common Core was of lower quality. They ignored the evidence from the best states and countries. In addition to that, they employ, and I think Dr. Moore will talk a little bit more about this in detail, instead of classic literature, poetry, and drama, they have an unusual idea. They want to dump a lot of historical text, informational text, and nonfiction into English class, even though English teachers are primarily interested and trained to teach literature. But specifically, they talk about using the Gettysburg Address as an exemplar text. That's great. I love the Gettysburg Address. But what the architects of Common Core tell the teachers to do is to do what they call cold reading. So you're supposed to forget that the Gettysburg Address takes place in the middle of the Civil War. You're supposed to forget that Lincoln is consecrating a cemetery. You're supposed to probably even forget the first line, which harkens back to the Continental Congress and the Declaration of Independence. This is a very peculiar, it's anti-historical, it's anti-intellectual, but it's a pretty dangerous idea too, because the fact is that if kids don't know any historical context, it's not going to mean very much to them, and it also makes them a lot more susceptible to being fed a lot of misinformation. The next piece of research that we took a look at was the legal dimensions of it, because the fact is that Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives for 30 years or so have known exactly what I mentioned at the beginning, which is that state and local governments have jurisdiction over K-12 education in this country. Even after 25 or 30 years of steady growth in the federal government's role in K-12 education, they still only fund about 10% of it. So 90% of public schooling is funded at the state and local level. So it's bizarre to have people dictate the standards to you and the tests to you while you get to pick up the tab. So what we did is we employed a general counsel and deputy general counsel under the second Bush administration. These are the two highest-ranking lawyers in the federal government, Kent Talbert and Bob Eitel, to look at the federal laws. And what they came back with, sort of dispassionate and lawyerly detail, is that there are 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibits the federal government from funding, directing, validating, encouraging national standards, testing, and curriculum. And those are the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which was signed by that great Tea Party president, Lyndon Johnson. There's the General Education Provisions Act, which was signed in 1970 by Richard Nixon. And then the enabling legislation that set up the U.S. Department of Education itself in 1979, and that was signed by Jimmy Carter. So while the advocates for Common Core like to paint people that disagree with them as being extremists or Tea Party people or what have you, the fact is that 2 of the 3 federal laws that prohibits them from doing what they're doing were signed by Democrats, and I would argue pretty liberal Democrats. But they went a step further. That is to say, the Obama administration went a step further. They didn't just they didn't use federal grants to encourage states to adopt national standards. They also directly funded 2 private national testing consortia to develop private tests. My state and your state are both in the PARC testing consortia, but there's another one called SBAC, or Smarter Balanced. And the U.S. Department of Education allocated about $360 million to these private entities to develop tests. The thing that's important to remember is that whether it's through the Governors Association developing the standards, or whether it's private organizations developing the test, none of these organizations are subject to sunshine laws or Freedom of Information Act searches or any kind of public transparency. They're not really even accountable to state legislatures, and in fact, what we know is that while most states adopted in the summer of 2010, when everyone else was relaxing and enjoying their summer, that's when most state boards of education adopted. But 95% of the state legislatures across the country had no bills or any hearings or any real public discussion about the adoption of these standards, even though this directly impacts state laws. But it wasn't just these 2 high-ranking lawyers that in D.C. that had this analysis. George Will, the syndicated columnist who touches about 30 million readers every week and has for 35 years, has done 2 columns on this topic, including one just in January, saying, look, the U.S. Department of Education, the Obama administration is just pretending that there are federal laws, that just brushing them aside. They're pretending that they don't exist, that they're doing exactly what federal law and the Constitution tells them they can't do. The third piece of research that we looked at was the cost. Even though the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has spent about $200 million, and they've given it to everybody. They've given it to the Fordham Institute, more right-leaning folks here in Ohio, to do evaluations of Common Core. They funded Fordham Institute to do a cost evaluation of Common Core. They've been funding all of the major trade organizations around K-12 education, the National Association of State Boards of Education, the teachers' unions, all the PTO, PTA, all the major players around education, they've been funding to advocate for this. But what they didn't do was do any cost projection on what's going to cost states and localities to implement it. In fact, Pioneer was the first institution in the country to do a cost projection. We got a guy named Tedra Barber, who had worked in the U.S. Department of Education under the first Bush administration and in the first administration of President Clinton. So he worked for both Republicans and Democrats. And he had a lot of experience on both Capitol Hill, but also testing at the state level. And what he and his researchers came up with was a projected cost of implementation at the state and local level nationally of $16 billion. Again, that 90% of that will be picked up by state and local governments. My state, Massachusetts, we got $250 million to ditch our higher standards and our testing through the race to the top. I understand Ohio also won race to the top. The only problem is that for my state, it's going to cost us $350 million to implement Common Core. So only a small portion of the $250 million that Massachusetts got to race to the top will actually go to implementing Common Core. There's other items in the race to the top application that they have to implement. But we should consider ourselves lucky in Massachusetts because here in Ohio it's going to cost you, by our projections, $628 million. And again, none of the players around this bothered to tell anybody what it was going to cost. After we released ours, the Fordham Institute, big Ohio player, they came out with their own cost analysis. The only problem for them, which was brought to light on a legislative hearing in Indiana by a state senator from rural Indiana, the Fordham Institute neglected to include the largest cost driver, which is the multi-year technology cost. So it was pretty embarrassing for them on the floor of the Senate to have to explain why they left out the biggest cost driver. There's other pieces of research that we have coming, including a paper that Jane Robbins, who's speaking next, on the data collection. So she can talk about that in a lot of detail. And Pioneer is a big advocate of school choice. The fact is that whether it's charter schools or vocational technical schools, or increasingly through school choice programs like in Indiana, voucher programs, and archdiocese schools, and many archdiocese schools across the country have adopted Common Core. The fact is that if all these different school choice options are being herded into the same set of standards or the same set of tests, there isn't going to be any school choice at all. And in fact, most of the big drivers behind Common Core, the Governor's Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, American Federation of Teachers, Achieving, all the big players from Washington, D.C. who are driving this over 25 or 30 years, not only are they not school choice advocates, they have been hostile to school choice. They are in no way, shape, or form considered on the vanguard of pushing for parental choice. So I've given you a lot of bad news, but there is some good news too. And one of the most immediate ones is the example in Indiana. The governor has just been sort of pushed into signing a law that pulls them out. That there's a long-term issue about what they're going to replace it with. There's other states. There's over 200 bills that are being circulated through state legislatures. Oklahoma, their state senate just in the last week has approved a bill to pull out following their House of Representatives. There's a variety of different states, including Utah and Alabama and Florida and Oklahoma and others that have pulled out of the national testing. Texas from the beginning, I mean, I think everyone should say a little prayer for Texas tonight, because from the beginning they said, we're not doing this. Don't mess with Texas. We're going to get the best standards experts. And we're going to elevate our standards higher. So for my money, Texas now has the highest academic standards in the country. And there's an enormous amount of pushback going on all over the country. The fact is that we can't respond to all of the inquiries that we have to speak because, you know, whether it's Salt Lake City or Indianapolis or Nashville or Tallahassee, moms in particular, and when you look over at the audience, it's almost all across the country, 70-80% of the people in the audience are moms, because the fact is that this is a genuine grassroots-driven effort. The moms and the grandmothers who do a lot of the work and the day in, day out work with their kids are seeing this poor quality. They're not happy about it. They can't get any questions answered. When they talk about opting their kids out of the testing, they get told that they're going to be suspended, or all kinds of things that you wouldn't expect from, well, I guess maybe we would expect that from public officials these days, but unfortunately, these kinds of things are only driving more and more animosity against Common Core across the country. So I guess you've been incredibly patient. I've given you a lot of information. I look forward to your questions, but I would encourage you to gather as much information you can on the topic. There's a great panel of folks here tonight, but there's a lot of information. Again, I can't underscore enough how impressive it is to see how well organized these moms are over social media and through groups all over the country. And you're seeing it whether it's in blue states or red states. People are really mobilizing because they're realizing that as bad as the Healthcare Act was, at least that was passed through Congress. At least it was validated by the U.S. Supreme Court. We may not like it, but Common Core never had any bills in Congress. There was never any national discussion. The people and parents were systematically bypassed, and state legislators were systematically bypassed. So again, thanks a lot, I appreciate it.